It was a sunny afternoon in a quiet suburban shopping plaza, the kind of place where parents push strollers, retirees sip coffee, and teenagers idle in their cars with music just a little too loud. But within minutes, this peaceful scene would explode into chaos. And at the center of it all, a parking spot. Not a robbery, not a long-standing feud, just a rectangle of painted asphalt. What no one knew that day was that one driver's impatience and another's determination to stand their ground would spark a confrontation so intense it would end in blood. And the scariest part, it could have happened to any of us. Michael Harris was 42, a father of two, known for his even-tempered nature at work but fiercely protective of what he considered principle in life. Friends described him as someone who wouldn't start a fight, but wouldn't walk away from one either. That afternoon, Michael had stopped at Willow Creek Plaza to grab last-minute supplies for his son's birthday. The parking lot was busy. Early summer heat and a weekend rush meant every spot was in demand. As he rounded the final row, he spotted it, a car pulling out near the entrance, just steps away from the store doors. From the opposite lane, another car also noticed the space. Behind the wheel was Daniel Cross, 36, a construction worker with a reputation for having a short fuse. His coworkers would joke, nervously, that Daniel had two speeds, fine and furious. As the exiting vehicle reversed, both Michael and Daniel angled toward the spot. Neither wanted to back down. It was here that the slow simmer began, a silent contest of wills in a sea of honking horns and impatient drivers. Witnesses would later say they saw the tension before the words. The sharp turns of steering wheels, the rev of engines, a language of aggression written in metal and rubber. In that moment, there was still a way out. But neither man took it. What started as a battle of inches was about to become a battle for control, one that would leave one man never going home. Before we continue, think about it. How many times have you felt that surge of irritation over something small? Let me know in the comments, because as you'll see, that tiny spark can turn into something deadly. A parking lot confrontation rarely makes headlines. But this one would, because it wasn't just the space that mattered. It was what the first words would ignite. Daniel rolled his window down first. "Hey, buddy, I was here first." His voice was sharp, with that biting edge that says, "I'm not asking, I'm telling." Michael, still inside his car, kept his hands on the wheel. "No, you weren't. I saw it before you even turned in." His tone was calm, but his jaw was tight. To the casual observer, this was just another petty dispute. But for both men, it was about respect. For Daniel, being cut off was an attack on his pride. For Michael, being told to move was a challenge to his sense of fairness. Neither intended to leave without proving they were right. The exchange grew louder. Windows down, voices carried across the lot. People looked up from their shopping carts. A mother pulling her toddler along whispered, "Come on, let's go," moving quickly toward her car. Inside Daniel's head, a familiar heat was rising. That flush in his chest, the pounding in his ears. He'd been here before. He hated being disrespected. Michael, on the other hand, was thinking, this guy's not going to bully me. They weren't really arguing about the spot anymore. They were fighting for dominance, in front of an unintentional audience. And when pride steps into the driver's seat, reason gets shoved in the trunk. Then, Daniel put his truck in park and opened his door. Witnesses say that's when the real danger began. What would you do here? Drive away or stand your ground? Drop your answer. It might surprise you how divided people are on this. You can feel the air change when two people decide they're done talking through a car window. That moment where you know, this is about to get physical. Daniel stepped out first, his steel-toed boots hitting the pavement with a heavy thud. He was broad-shouldered, arms tense, his work shirt still dusty from the day. Michael opened his door slower, deliberately. He wasn't rushing toward a fight, but he wasn't backing away from one either. He stood tall, hands at his sides, eyes locked on Daniel. The crowd was growing, a few people watching from a distance, some pulling out phones. In this age, every confrontation could become a viral video. But no one thought they were filming what would become evidence. Daniel closed the space between them. "Move your car," he said, his voice low but dangerous. Michael shook his head. "Not happening." At this point, witnesses said there was no shouting, just the kind of tight, clipped words you hear before something breaks. This was the tipping point. If either man had stepped back, this story wouldn't exist. But escalation is a two-way street, and both were pressing the gas. Then, Daniel's hand moved, not toward his phone, not toward his wallet, but to something in his back pocket. Would you have intervened if you saw this? Or would you have stayed out of it? Tell me in the comments. Sometimes, the difference between a heated argument and a deadly one is what's in a person's hand. Daniel pulled out a small metal object, a collapsible baton. The sight of it made several bystanders gasp. He flicked his wrist, and the baton extended with a sharp snap. Michael's eyes widened for a second, but his stance didn't change. "You're really gonna pull that over a parking spot," he said, voice steady but incredulous. The crowd murmured, a few people moving closer to their cars. No one wanted to be too close if this turned violent. In Daniel's mind, the baton wasn't about using it. It was about showing Michael he wasn't to be messed with. But Michael saw it differently. This wasn't intimidation, it was a threat. Once a weapon is visible, the dynamic shifts completely. It's no longer about words. It's about survival, or perceived survival. And then, Michael took a step forward. If someone pulled a weapon in front of you, would you freeze or fight? In conflicts, the first physical contact is the point of no return. Michael's step forward brought him within arm's reach. Daniel shoved him, hard, in the chest with his free hand. Michael staggered back but didn't fall. The crowd reacted audibly now. A man's voice could be heard on a phone call. "Yeah, there's about to be a fight." Michael steadied himself, his hands finally coming up defensively. "Don't touch me," he warned. But for Daniel, the act of shoving wasn't just a warning, it was a challenge. His adrenaline was spiking, his thinking clouded. When adrenaline and ego mix, rational thought takes a back seat. What might have been a parking dispute an hour earlier was now a test of who would back down first. Daniel's next move would seal both their fates. Pause for a second. Do you think anyone could have stopped them here? Or was it already too far gone? There's a split second where every fight could still end with both people walking away. This was that second. And it passed. Daniel raised the baton, pointing it directly at Michael's chest. Michael, now visibly angry, slapped it away with his forearm. The sound of metal hitting skin echoed in the lot. For Daniel, that was it, the moment his mind switched from show of force to use of force. Michael lunged forward, grabbing Daniel's arm. They struggled, bodies twisting, feet scraping on the pavement. Bystanders shouted, some pleading for them to stop. But it was as if the two men were locked in a tunnel where no other voices existed. This was no longer about a parking spot, or even about pride. It was about control, and neither was willing to lose it. In the scuffle, Daniel's other hand moved toward his waistband. Would you have stepped in here if you were watching? Or would the sight of that baton have kept you back? In confrontations, the introduction of a second weapon is often where fatal outcomes are sealed. From his waistband, Daniel pulled a small handgun. Gasps erupted from the crowd. Michael froze for half a second, then tried to back away. His hands came up instinctively, palms out. "Hey, it's not worth it," he said quickly. But Daniel's face was unreadable, locked in the kind of focus that comes when someone's brain is running on pure rage. People scrambled for cover. The mother with the toddler ducked behind a nearby SUV. A store employee inside dialed 911, her voice trembling. This was the moment the story stopped being a fight and became a crime. The sound that followed would silence the parking lot. We've all been angry, but what's the angriest you've ever been? Could you imagine it going this far? After violence, there's always a moment of eerie silence. The gunshot cracked through the air, echoing off the surrounding buildings. Michael staggered back, a look of disbelief frozen on his face, before collapsing to the asphalt. Daniel stood still, breathing heavily, the gun still raised. For a moment, it seemed he didn't fully register what he had done. The crowd remained frozen, shock holding them in place. Then, movement, people rushing to Michael's side, others shouting at Daniel to drop the weapon. Daniel slowly lowered the gun, his expression unreadable. In less than 5 minutes, a man had gone from running an errand to lying lifeless on the ground, all over a strip of asphalt. And then the sound of sirens began to grow louder. Type 5 minutes in the comments if you believe that's all it can take for a life to change forever. When the police arrive, the chaos often hardens into reality. 2 squad cars pulled into the lot, lights flashing. Officers stepped out, weapons drawn, shouting commands. Daniel didn't resist. He placed the gun on the hood of his truck and raised his hands. Meanwhile, bystanders worked frantically on Michael, but it was clear the injury was fatal. One officer cuffed Daniel, reading him his rights, while another moved the crowd back. The lot was now a crime scene. Shoppers who had been moments away from buying groceries were now witnesses to a killing. For many present, This was the first time they had ever seen death up close. And it wasn't in a war zone or a dangerous neighborhood. It was a suburban shopping center. What Daniel told officers on the way to the station would shock even them. If you think this was already shocking, hit the like button, because what he said next will leave you stunned. Sometimes, the most chilling part of a crime is not what happened, but how casually it's explained afterward. In the back of the patrol car, Daniel seemed calm. Too calm. He told the officers, "He disrespected me. You can't let people do that. If you back down once, you're done for." There was no mention of fear for his safety. No claim that Michael had a weapon. Just a belief that walking away would make him weak. It was the purest form of instant rage, a split-second decision made permanent by the pull of a trigger. This wasn't a crime of passion in the traditional sense. It wasn't planned. It was a chain of decisions, each one taking him closer to a point of no return. And yet, Daniel's lawyer would try to argue self-defense. Do you believe that claim could stand? Comment yes or no. I want to see where you stand on this. The parking lot was now quiet, but the echoes of that day had moved into another arena, the courtroom. Daniel's trial began 6 months later. The charge, second-degree murder. His defense, self-defense. His attorney painted a picture of a man threatened, claiming Michael was advancing aggressively and that Daniel had no choice but to use his weapon. The prosecution, however, showed the surveillance footage, grainy but clear. It captured the shove, the baton, and Michael stepping back before the shot. Jurors leaned forward as the video played. You could almost feel the temperature in the room shift. Family members sat on opposite sides, Michael's wife clutching a tissue, Daniel's mother shaking her head in disbelief. Trials aren't just about facts. They are about who can make the jury feel a certain way. And in this case, the battle was over whether Daniel's actions were fear or fury. Then, a surprise witness took the stand, someone who had never spoken publicly about that day. If you were on this jury, which way would you be leaning right now? Tell me, prosecution or defense? Sometimes, one voice in a courtroom can shift the entire weight of a case. The witness was a teenage boy, 17 years old, who had been sitting in his car just a few feet away from the confrontation. He testified that Michael never moved toward Daniel after seeing the gun. That in fact, Michael had backed up, hands open, saying, "It's not worth it." The courtroom was silent as he spoke. Even Daniel's attorney didn't seem to have a follow-up question that could discredit him. The boy admitted he hadn't come forward right away because he was scared. But after seeing news reports framing the shooting as possibly justified, he felt compelled to speak. This was the kind of testimony that tears through a defense strategy, because it wasn't just evidence, it was a human moment. Still, Daniel's team wasn't done. They had one more card to play, and it involved Michael's past. Do you think it's fair for a victim's past to be brought up in court? Comment your thoughts. This one gets controversial. In court, truth isn't always the whole story. Sometimes it's about the story you can make people believe. Daniel's defense brought up an incident from 5 years earlier where Michael had been involved in a heated altercation at a sports game. It hadn't resulted in charges, but witnesses then had described him as getting in people's faces. They used it to argue that Michael had a history of confrontation. The implication was clear. Maybe he'd been the aggressor here, too. Michael's family looked crushed. To them, this wasn't about who he was as a person. It was about dragging his name through the mud to save the man who killed him. The prosecution fought back, pointing out the irrelevance of an unrelated event and focusing again on the video and eyewitness testimony from that day. Character attacks can sway jurors if they tap into existing biases. But in this case, the physical evidence was stubbornly clear. And then, after 2 weeks of testimony, the jury was sent to deliberate. If you've been following this case with me, pause and drop your verdict in the comments before we hear the juries. Every courtroom has that moment when the air feels heavier, when the bailiff walks in and says, "The jury has reached a verdict." The jury filed in, their faces unreadable. The 4 persons stood, holding the slip of paper that would decide Daniel's future. On the charge of second-degree murder, we find the defendant guilty. Gasps. Michael's wife broke into tears, gripping her sister's hand. Daniel's shoulders slumped, his jaw clenched but his eyes wet. The judge thanked the jury for their service and set sentencing for the following month. Daniel was led out in handcuffs. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed. Some framed the case as a tragic example of parking lot rage, while others called it a lesson in how pride can kill. The verdict gave Michael's family some measure of justice, but justice doesn't erase the hole left behind. And when sentencing day came, the judge's words were as much a warning to society as they were a punishment for Daniel. Type justice in the comments if you believe the jury made the right call. Courtrooms don't just decide fates. They sometimes leave behind lessons we're all meant to hear. On sentencing day, Daniel stood before the judge. His attorney asked for leniency, citing no prior criminal record and his role as the sole provider for his family. The prosecution countered, emphasizing the reckless disregard for life Daniel had shown. The judge spoke slowly, choosing his words with precision. This was not self-defense. This was ego. A moment of anger that took a man's life and shattered two families. Let this serve as a reminder that in the space of a breath, a decision can be irreversible. Daniel was sentenced to 25 years in prison, eligible for parole after 18. Michael's children would grow up without their father. Daniel's children would grow up visiting theirs behind glass. No one truly won this case. A parking spot cost two families their futures as they knew them. If you've watched this story all the way through, share it, not for views, but so someone, somewhere, might think twice before letting rage take control. And remember, you can't win an argument if you lose your freedom.